The views and opinions expressed by the guests and hosts of this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the Lansdowne Public Library or its affiliates.
Welcome to this edition of the Lansdowne Public Library's podcast, Geek Out,
where we geek out about just about anything.
This week, during the month of October, sometimes referred to as the spooky month by many younger generations, we have two people joining us today. We have John and Laura, who were on here at least once before. Twice before.
Downton Abbey and
the Oscars.
That's right, I forgot you were here for Downton. Well, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
As it is October, this month we will be talking about horror films, which is admittedly a very broad topic, so don't expect us to cover necessarily your favorite. You know, we can't.
Especially not your favorite.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to fit in everything from House of the Devil to Insidious: The Red Door.
Oh, but I can talk a little bit about that.
There's a lot between those 2 points.
Well, let's just start off with like a baseline. What got you into horror movies?
Well, for me, I was about 8 or 9 years old. And my mom was not home. She was probably working, but my dad was home, and he thought, 8 years old, perfect time for The Exorcist. And honestly, it was the perfect time because it showed me, I was just watching like, can they do that? Is that okay?
Is this allowed?
Is this allowed? And it wasn't in a lot of places because it was banned.
Oh, yeah.
But not in my living room, and that thoroughly freaked me out. But I'm glad it did, because it's fun to be freaked out.
For me, I definitely sort of had a complicated relationship with horror growing up, because I didn't watch a lot of, I certainly didn't see The Exorcist until I was, into my 20s.
And it shows.
And I totally admit that. I was definitely, definitely apprehensive of horror. I feel like I scared easily, but I also was very, drawn to it. If it was on, I couldn't look away. I remember I loved a lot of, the old classic monster movies. That's what my dad raised me on more so, Bride of Frankenstein especially, a lot of the silent classics. But also, I distinctly remember the first time I saw Jaws as a kid, and again, being utterly horrified but unable to look away. And there's, so many movies that you kind of, I hit a milestone until, I think, pretty much when I knew John, that, I was just sort of thrown into, but also really started to enjoy it more, and, found a lot more cathartic comfort in watching horror movies.
How about you, Jeff?
Oh, I literally do not remember a time before horror, if that stands to reason. Most of my childhood memories are the family gathering around to watch Tales from the Crypt on HBO. Considering the show started a little before I was born, it stands to reason I have probably basically always watched it. The only thing that I remember that I was actually afraid of when I was little from that was the Crypt Keeper himself. When I was a little kid, he creeped me right the heck out. And then I would just watch this show where people were murdering each other or an evil doll would be doing something, That never bothered. The Crypt Keeper did, and I certainly had my eyes covered numerous times due to scenes of nudity, but other than that...
Yeah, that's where the line was drawn.
Yeah, that says a lot about my family, I think, that it's no. Murder? Fine. Boobs? Probably too young for boobs.
Well, our family, too. I watched a lot of gruesome deaths, but it'd be you can't watch that. There's, topless girls.
Yeah, no, I had a similar experience watching quite violent stuff with my mom, who was, before she retired, a director of religious education. And when people's heads were exploding, all I heard her going, oh, cool! So, that also explains a lot, I think.
How about you? When did you get your start with horror?
Probably early on with Universal stuff. Probably mostly with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. But I also do not do horror well, so it's not my genre of choice. I do like a good creature feature, but it's probably notorious at this point. I've been scared of the dumbest things. So,
I feel like, to be fair, that's horror in a nutshell. When I was a kid, the one movie I remember that scared me is Arachnophobia.
That's a fun one.
That's a comedy. That is more funny than it is scary as an adult.
Good special effects, though.
Yes.
Good effects movie.
I vividly remember the spiders crawling out of the woman's mouth.
Yeah.
Like, that's with me to this day, for better or worse.
Visuals and effects also play into why I start to really like genre. I mean, like, I also, as a kid, more so was into, like, I was drawn to, like, fantasy. But there were, like, the fantasy movies that definitely had, like, horror elements on. Like, one of my favorites growing up was Legend.
Oh, yeah.
Which there's unicorns in it. Young Tom Cruise with really bad teeth. But then there's also Tim Curry as a demon. And I remember thinking, like, he was quite interesting, but very, like, I was very drawn to that, and, like, a lot of, like, this, like, gothic kind of fantasy element that led the way to, like, wanting to see other movies with similar effects and prosthetic makeup, and just being drawn to that kind of, like, what only a movie can do is just sort of create this world that, you know, you just don't see every day.
Like, what about the Swamp Witch from that? That's impressive, and she's probably the freakiest thing in that film.
I see, when I was a kid, I remember watching it and being like, I don't know if I can do this, because literally the first scene is, I don't know if they're in hell or it's like a hellish domain, but there's just silhouettes of guys getting chopped up for meat, you know, and they're alive while they're on the table, and it's like, whoa, and like my parents said there were unicorns, but then it's like, but also I kind of am digging this vibe too. Definitely, like, you know, I love horror that just sort of, like, draws in so many genres. Comedy horror, you brought up Abbott and Costello, is a huge favorite.
Comedy and horror go...
Oh, yeah.
That's two peas in a pod, honestly. Even if you're watching a horror movie that's not funny, you'll catch yourself getting scared and then start laughing, because it's such a balance between the two.
I would actually say my only, like, more mainstream, like, going into horror films was I saw for the first time last year the original Scream.
Oh, yeah.
And mostly because my friends were like, it's a lot more funny than it is, like, scary. And I'm like, oh, yeah. And if I see a slasher movie, I'm not really interested.
Yeah.
But, like, Scream was a scream.
Yeah.
And not necessarily in a, you know.
Scream, though, I will say, Scream... That movie has a lot of really just like parts that are funny, but also really scary at the same time. The whole ending of that movie, I don't want to spoil. I mean, it's
like, what, 20 years old? How old is Scream?
Are we
99, I think?
This is a spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Alex, note, please put a spoiler note on this.
Yeah, you know, just going forward, assume, as with most of our podcasts, we're going to talk about things, there will be some spoilers.
Okay.
Well, if we do, like, talk about Insidious, that's the recent one.
Yeah, that one we might hesitate
I wouldn't do
right,
that,
like,
but Scream came out in 96. Like,
that's as old as I am, and I'm old, so, like...
Yeah, Dave, you're so old.
I'm dying over here.
At the end of Scream, you find out that it's the killers. There's two of them. It's Sydney's boyfriend and his friend, played by the immaculate Matthew Lillard. And they're just having the most insane conversations in the kitchen. And there is just this outrageous amount of blood just everywhere, because they're stabbing each other and laughing, and like it's funny, but it's also kind of like, ew. So I mean, I think, like, to your point, that's a great movie to start on, because I think starting with slashers is pretty easy because they're really not scary. So you can find some. My favorite horror movie of all time, and the objective best horror movie of all time, is the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is technically a slasher, but it's so much more than a slasher. I saw that. But Scream is perfect to start on, because you get the slasher stuff, but it's also just a huge deconstruction of horror as a whole. Well, it's actually not written by Wes Craven, but it was directed by Wes Craven, and it's, I mean, who better to do that? And what she also did, I think, kind of force with The People Under the Stairs. I think that was before Scream, and that was also kind of a wink-wink, nudge-nudge horror movie.
There's a lot of those, to be fair. You have Cabin in the Woods, the whole 9 yards.
Wes Craven's New Nightmare he did, with Freddy Krueger.
Yeah.
Which was pretty much, was that before Scream or after Scream?
I believe that's before Scream.
Either way, he's really good at that, at doing this.
Yeah.
Definitely hit that kind of meta thing, but it still worked, where, like, the movies can be disturbing, but they're also a lot of fun.
And he started with Last House on the Left, which is just like, please. There's actually a great story when they were making this movie. They shot a scene, and they all looked at each other, and they were like, are we really doing this right now? Like, are we really making this? But yeah, that's...
Scare their creators.
Yeah.
With horror especially, I feel you kind of have to push a few boundaries to get anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the name of the game.
I kind of, for me, the best horror is it pushes boundaries while also really shining a light on actual issues or upsetting things that, like, you know, are part of just our world or society. I kind of think what's interesting about going the decade of horror is you really see the themes of what people were terrified at the time.
Yeah.
Like, you can say, like, the 50s was a lot of, like, the Red Scare. You get, like, Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
A bunch of alien movies.
I will say Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the end of the peace and love era. The Manson murders happened.
Yep.
And then a couple years later, Tobe Hooper hits us with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is filled with a bunch of hippies in a van who are out of
pretty much get dismembered.
So yeah, no, that's a good point though. It's cool to see horror movies through the years as reflections of what was just kind of going on in everyone's mind right now. Like now, I think is what's cool is you get movies like Get Out, which is racial tension, but then there's like Hereditary, which is grief, and that's a topic that I feel like people are more comfortable to talk about nowadays, is the handling of mental health and grief. And I feel like Hereditary was just this primal scream of letting out grief.
Yeah.
Hereditary is very disturbing. One that actually is one of the creepiest movies I've ever seen, The Babadook.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Also about like a parent-child relationship that is like on the strains, you know, and it's just kind of this like frightful look of motherhood that you're not used to seeing. But when you think about parenting, it's kind of terrifying. And movies sometimes shine a light on the things that, grief, you know, that's kind of a mundane, like we all experience it, but it can be like some of the worst, most traumatizing thing you go through. And to see a movie illustrate that in a certain way, that's what I mean by cathartic comfort, is it kind of helps you put feeling or even words to it.
I mean, at the end of Hereditary, and that I will not spoil, but Toni Collette's character like literally lets out this scream that just feels like everything is finally boiled over. She was robbed, by the way. She should have gotten an Oscar for that performance.
Horror actresses usually.
Yeah. As discussed, there are a handful of genres that the Academy doesn't care for, and horror is pretty high on that list.
Yes, we stand Final Girls.
And Toni Collette especially.
Oh, she was just so good.
To sort of add on to that, about the perspective of like sort of the time, one thing that, again, kind of recently, I'm not into horror, but I'm big into giant monster movies, like Japanese giant monster movies.
They
are.
Yeah,
they absolutely are.
The granddaddy of them all absolutely does. Yeah. The first Godzilla film.
It's creepy.
It's funny you bring that up. The first half of that movie scared the crap out of me as a kid.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, too.
And
stuff in the cave and what is it, like the little, like...
earwigs, but they're big.
Yeah. They're dragonfly larvae, is what they're supposed to be, which are little monsters in their own right.
Oh, yes. Dragonflies are technically the most efficient killer in the world of nature.
You heard it here, folks.
They have a 98% success rating for hunts. That's unheard of for other animals.
Overachievers, if you ask me.
Specifically, I grew up with like the American version of Godzilla, King of the Monsters, but the original Japanese version, Gojira, has such a tonal shift. It is unbelievable, and honestly, watching it, I'm not scared, because I knew generally what happens with everything, but I felt genuine like pain and sorrow, because yes, it's a giant lizard that breathes fire, but it is, in all facets, a representation of just nuclear weaponry. Mm-hmm. And there's a scene that was cut. Well, actually, it wasn't cut, but in the original film, there's a woman holding her children on the street, and she's just telling them to just close their eyes. Because basically, Godzilla walks like right over them. Either a building collapses or they're torched or whatever happens. And it's almost silent when it happens. Like, you hear her voice, but everything's quiet. In the American version, she is drowned out. You can't understand her at all. They didn't even try to dub her. They blast the soundtrack over it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of depth that is lost from that. And again, that tonal shift, even just throughout the film, they're just casually talking like, everything's been worse since the end of the war and whatnot. And it's like, whoa!
It's definitely this, you're getting Japan's reaction to bombings at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I got chills, again, grew up watching Godzilla, didn't think anything of it. I was more comfortable with Godzilla versus Mothra and, all like the showdowns. That's what I love.
The fun ones.
I still love, the fun ones. But when I remember reading how Godzilla's design is initially meant to look like the burn victims of the bombings, that just sort of changes everything. But you think about, like, this was these people's answer to the grief and the horrors. They were still living.
Yeah. And again, that's much like if you go year by year and decade by decade in American horror, you see what scared us. You can get a really interesting perspective on other cultures by watching their horror.
Oh, sure.
You know, you get Asian horror is pretty intense. Like, they have a lot more psychological stuff going on. You know, while we were doing the slasher genre, they were doing weird experimental stuff like, what is it, House?
House
Love
is my
House.
favorite movie.
Yeah, House is great.
Interestingly enough, too, the director and writer of House actually co-wrote that movie with his young daughter as a way for him to come to terms with his having a kid during the bombings.
Yeah.
And his daughter's fear is just a child. And that's why that movie's so weird, because it is kind of like childish, but then also really disturbing to an adult. So there's kind of this, like, again, that was their way of making something out of their fears, which that movie I think is wonderful. But it definitely is like an experimental.
It's a one-of-a-kind piece.
So good.
Definitely worth watching. I know it's on one of the streaming platforms right now.
Should be on all of the streaming platforms.
It may even be public domain.
Oh, wow.
It should be Mega Criterion.
Well, it is in the Criterion.
It is in the Criterion.
Yeah, but like, it needs another
it should be in
tier.
the- yeah, gotcha. Sure. Yeah, Japanese horror is probably some of my favorite Japanese and Korean horror. I just watched this movie recently. It was kind of the start of the quote-unquote J-horror boom that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, which a lot of people associate with the original Ring movie, which is honestly more of a mystery than it is a horror movie. But this movie is called Cure, which is also a mystery. And I don't know why I'm talking about this. I just feel like I have to because I haven't been affected by something like this in some time. Another movie I don't want to spoil, and I think this is a good time to kind of just also talk about like how with comedy the horror blends in, but this is a great like mystery with horror that you see a lot now too. Like Ring is a mystery with horror. Saw is more of a mystery than a horror movie.
Yeah,
I think.
I mean,
really
the early Saws,
but it's
just
you got me
horror
monologuing.
exists in many forms. You know,
Yeah,
it's
wonderful.
I think some people do just picture like, oh, the monsters or the slashers, you know. But it's like horror can like creep into a movie. Like there are dramas that I argue it's a family drama, but the content is so disturbing.
Oh,
it's
sure.
kind of becoming a horror movie.
Sure.
Yeah, they're literal biography films that have horror elements. Oh God, Mommy Dearest. That's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah. No hanging wires. That's a scene from a horror film.
Yes.
And it happened to a person.
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
Like, even if you don't think you like horror, I guarantee you there is something that either has a horror element to it or just a weird off piece that you'll find that you absolutely enjoy, whether it be, you know, giant monsters or the comedies and on the very weird cases, the musicals. You know, I don't know anybody who doesn't enjoy Little Shop of Horrors. You know, it's a classic for a reason.
Even when it's like a horror movie, like there's horror movies that have other genres within it, like, you know, Cure or Ring or Saw or Get Out's funny. But then, you know, on the flip side of that, there's something very striking when you're watching something that's not a horror movie, but then it just like hits you with horror when you're not expecting. And the first thing that comes to mind is Trainspotting.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of like, haha, look how fun this life is living like this. We're real party animals. And son, if you've seen it, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Something happens about halfway through, and all of a sudden, it's not fun anymore. And the horror, and it's like, I can't believe I'm comparing Trainspotting to Godzilla. But, you know, when, like you said, there's a tonal shift. And I think horror can really, more than anything, hit that very well.
Yeah, some directors, I think, flourish in that. One of the most disturbing movies, and it might be considered horror, but I always thought it would be a drama, was Requiem for a Dream. I'm never watching that again because it's so disturbing.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, there's no supernatural, there's no murder, I don't think. It's just upsetting, kind of the way Trainspotting, because it's highlighting drug use and addiction in a way that is so uncomfortable.
It is a horror. It's a drama. People say it's a drama. But it is that Requiem for a Dream is a horror movie.
I would rather watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre 5 times in a row than go anywhere.
Requiem for a Dream makes Texas Chainsaw look like a screwball comedy.
Yeah, that is very true.
From what I understand about the making of Texas Chainsaw, it might as well have been.
Yeah.
I love like the kind of lore behind these low budget horror movies that have since become legendary.
Yeah.
But, like Chainsaw, Night of the Living Dead. It's like that started a whole genre of Pennsylvania represent.
Yeah.
But
that's what we were afraid of in Pennsylvania in the 60s.
Zombies.
That's what I'm afraid of now.
Pittsburgh. Yeah, it's just, I think that's like also kind of what's cool, and I think why like a lot of people who are just interested in filmmaking are drawn to them too. There's a lot of great stories behind making these movies.
Yeah, horror movies, I feel especially, end up with some very interesting stories, to the point that there are countless like urban legends. There's like a cannibal holocaust. There's the true stories, many of which are kind of messed up, but then there's also like a whole meta fake story that goes with the movie and the filming. At Blair Witch, similarly.
That was brilliant. That was like the best advertising a movie could possibly.
Yeah, I just wish I liked the film better.
Well, there's a lot of walking around and irony.
Yeah,
What's going on?
It is definitely,
the ending is cool.
The ending is neat. It is what is it? I think it's a 90-minute movie with about 30 minutes worth of ideas.
Yes.
And that happens, but it was weird. It was different. It's experimental, and I think that's where horror shines. Is every genre has its experimental films, but when horror decides to try and get weird...
Oh, God, it's the best.
It's weird. We actually just watched a very weird movie, an Italian horror movie from the 90s. Again, kind of just verging on a comedy. It's called Cemetery Man, and it's about a cemetery caretaker who's just part of his job is stopping the dead from rising as they do. But then it also gets into his love life and his, just sort of weird relationship with people in the town. And it's very beautiful because the shots are very, artsy and strange, but whoa.
That sounds awesome.
It is so silly.
I recommend it.
But it's so
cautiously.
fun. I don't even cautiously recommend it. I say just watch it.
I just feel like
if you can find it, it's hard to find.
It's very much like House, where it's like, this got weird, but at the same time, you'll never forget it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll never forget Cemetery Man, for sure.
I have to give that one a look.
Available through Interlibrary Loan, I will say.
Good to know. Yeah.
Nice segue.
Library services.
I mean, and to be fair, I don't know that horror film would have ever happened without, especially, the gothic horrors. There's no Nosferatu without Dracula. Lord knows there's dozens and dozens of attempts to make a good movie out of Frankenstein.
True. I would argue the best Frankenstein movie is Bride of Frankenstein.
That could be a whole podcast in and of itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Frankenstein. Yeah. I like Son of Frankenstein.
There was one there was a more modern one that I did actually like that more closely followed the book.
I Frankenstein?
No, that followed a different book. No, it has no, not that modern. I'm talking like early 90s.
Roger Corman did one, but then there was one.
That's Frankenstein Unleashed. That is a fantastically bad movie.
Roger Corman.
Yeah, it's Roger Corman and Raul Julia. Who plays Dr. Frankenstein. Yeah.
Was it the one with De Niro?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That one actually, That one actually followed the book and still wasn't the best movie, but they
hard
tried
book to adapt.
It is. It's
one of the first, if not the first, films. Thomas Edison's Frankenstein.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He is one of the early ones.
If you can find clips on YouTube,
it's lost, isn't it? But the whole thing.
You'll never see all of it.
It's more found than some other movies.
The coolest parts is actually him making the monster you can see on YouTube. It's weird looking. Silent films already kind of have that uncanny motion about them. Again, I actually think some of the greatest horror moments come silent film. We brought Nosferatu, Lon Chaney, Vampire. Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera has some
goat
scenes.
Yeah. Lon Chaney,
Lon Chaney is the goat.
Yeah, Lon Chaney and Lon Chaney Jr. are both phenomenal.
Absolutely.
You have
silent
Karloff,
film.
Lugosi, it's...
If you kind of want that, I can't watch a slasher or a gory film, but, I kind of want the spooky vibes, go on YouTube, find, an old silent horror film. It'll do the trick.
Yeah. Or, and any of the classics, the original Dracula, Frankenstein. You're not going to get much... The Invisible...
Highest body count of all of them, I think. He makes that train crash.
I have very vivid memories of the first time I watched that movie. because it was less than a year after The Emperor's New Groove came off. And he pulls the lever and the thing just flies off a cliff. And I yelled out, why do we even have that lever? And that's all I could think about with that movie now, is that scene where it's just like, no, why did they have the lever to derail a train?
How about that? We go from Train Spotting to Godzilla, to Invisible Man to Emperor's New Groove.
That's horror.
This is the best podcast of all time. Joe Rogan Hill.
Horror is an influential genre.
Yeah, it is.
It absolutely is.
It touches everything. Although now that I think about it, I kind of wish there were more animated horror films.
Ooh, that's a good point. There is some good...
What was that new one? Mad God?
Mad God,
yeah.
Has anyone seen that?
I haven't seen that. That's on Shudder.
I really want to watch that.
I think it's another point too. I know there's tons of adult animation, and I know there's a lot of Japanese anime horror.
There are a lot of
really
horror anime,
or even just shows. But I will say, sometimes also don't look further than the kid movies. The book itself is disturbing, but Coraline, don't underestimate that one. That's pretty creepy.
Yeah, when you really get down to what that movie's about, it's like, oh god.
And the animation's also, again, stop motion.
Stop motion.
Silent film. Pretty weird looking.
It is exactly the right amount of unnatural to make it better.
I was a little afraid of James and Giant Peach growing up, just because it's kind of dark and weird.
Yeah, that movie is weird.
There's definitely a scene where clouds turn into rhinoceroses and eat people.
They never did catch that rhino.
Yeah.
I love that movie.
I forgot all about the scene where he fights Jack Skellington underwater, and I was like, am I watching this movie?
In that movie.
And it's funny, a lot of these movies, especially kids ones, they come from authors. I mean, we mentioned Coraline by Neil Gaiman, but Roald Dahl, these books are disturbing.
Oh, yeah.
I love them as a kid, but if you've ever read The Witches and then seen the movie adaptation, you know what I'm talking about. It's weird.
I haven't seen the new version of that.
I actually need to see The Witches.
The Witches. There was a recent new adaptation. There's also a comic adaptation of it not too long ago.
I just remember being really creeped out by that as a kid reading the book.
Yeah.
That begs a question. Oh, what's that Studio Leica film? Paranorman. Does that count as horror?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's definitely more to the comedy horror side of horror, but yeah, it's a for kids horror film.
Go for it.
Might I pose this to the better experts here? Does horror have to be scary?
I think that's a subjective thing, though, right? Because what scares you might not scare someone else.
I mean, that is the thing. I would not call House a scary movie, but it's definitely a horror movie.
I think there has to be something that is quote-unquote horrific in it.
It's so weird because, Shaun of the Dead, it's more comedy than horror, but it is a horror film.
There's imagery in that when I think back, I'm like,
oh yeah, there are some very gory kills in there, but I still wouldn't really call it scary at any point.
No, but even though you're saying with House, it's not scary, but I would be scared if my piano ate me.
Yeah. I choose to believe that's why there's that evil piano in Mario 64, because they watched House.
Do not hate that piano.
You'd hate the one in House?
I like that one better. The Mario one is scary.
There's also floating heads and,
Yeah, it is a ghost story.
Numbered,
It's a ghost story.
With a smile on his face.
A smile on his face. And a man turns
the guy turns to bananas. Yes, I was about to say that.
That still stumps me to this day. Why do you turn to bananas?
Oh, I don't think anybody knows.
I feel like it's some weird cultural joke I just don't get. But it also could be because the film was partly written by a 6-year-old.
Yeah, no.
And she just thought
about this
funny.
Character?
Hey,
we got to do something. What do you want to do? Turn them into bananas. Done.
Brilliant.
Then they did, and you're like, whoa, how'd they do that?
It is one of those weird, and your mileage will vary on a lot of horror films, whether or not they are scary to people.
Absolutely.
I don't think Saw movies are scary. I just think they're kind of gross.
I don't know about that.
I can't watch.
I
can't watch Saw.
I don't like the Saw films. I don't generally like gore for the sake of gore, but I'm at no point am I scared because I know the answer to every question is they're just going to die in a horrific way. And also, an unfortunate truth of the modern slasher genre is the films go out of their way to make you not like the people who die because they kind of want you to root for the slasher.
It's sort of an interesting turn. I feel like
that's a more,
not how they started.
No, because like
where we are.
You were upset when people died in, the early Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Streets.
Yes and no. I do feel like in the original Halloween, those are all pretty annoying teenagers, except for Jamie Lee Curtis. And usually the final girl archetype you root for because she is usually the most sympathetic character. And that's the point, she survives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, I think we watched, for the first time a few years ago, Trick or Treat, which is a huge cult classic.
Yep.
And I found all those characters annoying.
There was,
I wasn't rooting for anybody.
There's no one to root for in that film.
And you're right, you definitely get the idea. It's like, we care about the people killing them. And it's like, okay. But then it's just horror for the sake of horror. It's not really telling me something about why I should be scared of Halloween. Halloween does that.
Sometimes slasher movies are just fun.
Yeah. A few of them have gotten a little longer in the tooth than others.
Friday the 13th, Part 4. You got Christopher Glover dancing. That's amazing. And you got Corey Feldman. A
lot of horror. There's all those 80s actors that just staple after a point.
Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
Oh, Dream Warriors?
Yeah.
I do love that movie.
Welcome to Primetime.
Yeah. Actually, one of my favorite, it's not new, but I've come to love the Child's Play Chucky's franchise just because the first movie, it's pretty creepy.
Yeah.
They get
it's
so
a proper horror
funny
film.
To that point that the funny, campy ones are definitely my favorite because it is sort of exploiting the whole, it's a killer doll. It's what it is, but, we're going to burn John Waters in this one. I'm there.
It has always kind of surprised me how much I continue to like the Child's Play franchise, whereas Nightmare on Elm Street by 4, I was just like, all right, we're done here. Why are we making more of these? And Halloween, other than the fact that when we hit 3, I was like, okay, this is just a completely different movie. And I kind of wish they had stuck, let's just keep doing something different. I like Season of the Witch.
Me too. 8 more days till Halloween.
Yeah. And I feel like the movie kind of gets unfortunate flack because everyone was expecting a continuation of the last story.
Even though there was none.
Yeah.
He blew up.
Exactly. It's like, let this
What is he, though? And then...
They blew up the shark jaws a lot, yet somehow...
Okay, to be fair, they are actually other sharks.
Yeah, those are the same shark.
Might have been a better series if it was the same shark just right more damage
together.
Yes, someone
just
stitched it back to... Okay.
I've seen a zombie shark. I might as well have seen...
I've seen a ghost shark.
Oh.
I think the movie was terrible.
I've seen a Sharknado.
Think of any word with a shark, and they've
done a film. Yeah,
the shark movies.
We literally just had The Meg 2 this year.
We gotta watch that.
I'm very excited to watch the Meg 2 because the first one, it knew what it was. Let's be real.
That's always kind of my worry with those films, though, because Sharknado knows what it was, and it really did not need sequels.
No, it kind of would have been nice. Just that was a funny movie. That was a funny movie.
That was, Snakes on a Plane works great because there's no Snakes on a Plane 2.
Do we want to wiki fact check that, or?
I am going to stand by this because even if there is a Snakes on a Plane 2, there isn't.
Direct-to-DVD ones don't count. They're not actual sequels.
What?
I know there is a Snakes on a Train, both a children's book and a knockoff horror movie, I think, by The Asylum.
Who, again, another podcast.
I would love to do an episode on Asylum films. I feel like that's something we could actually bring up, is there are a lot of, horror, not just franchises, because, we've touched on that a little bit here, especially in the slasher genres, horror tends to fall into franchises.
They're easy with slasher ones.
Here's this again. But then you also have, the horror studios. Because, you have, Full Moon?
Love Full Moon. Love them.
Who have the range from the early Puppet Master films, which are phenomenal horror pictures, to Evil Bong versus the Ginger Dead Man.
I was really hoping you would bring up Evil Bong and use Full Moon features.
I kind of had to, right?
Yeah.
There's so many questions.
Are any of these the studios that make the Leprechaun films?
No, surprisingly.
Because all I remember is the one Leprechaun movie that I've seen, not by choice,
Is it in space or is it in the hood?
In the hood, and he does kill a man with a bong, which I thought was very out of character. They seemed like they were chilling.
Yeah, the leprechaun in the Leprechaun films is kind of a jackass.
He kind of is, but he's...
It was rooting for him, I guess.
Well, because everyone's really stupid.
I mean, like, it's interesting because you do kind of root for the leprechaun, but a lot more people in those movies are... Because after, I think, the first one, they just went straight comedy. The people are at least fun, so you feel a little bad when they die. Whereas then you have, like, the antithesis of Leprechaun, which is Wishmaster, which are remarkably similar franchises, except Wishmaster tried to stay serious. To middling effect.
When I think of horror studios, I always think of you as, like, Universal. That's your...
Yeah.
And then, for me, I love the Hammer horror.
Kind of like the old school iconic.
Yeah.
For people who don't know, the Hammer films are probably the best-known Hammer films, at least, are the Vincent Price horror, especially the whole Edgar Allan... Vincent Price is in the...
Few, but
he's in the...
Peter Cushing.
Peter Cushing is the later ones, and Lee. All the people you think of in your head when you think of, like, old man in a horror film.
There's a lot of that, yeah.
That's the Hammer film.
There's also kind of like, you have studios. You also have, like, the iconic actors.
Oh, yeah.
Like you mentioned a few right there. Yeah. And, of course, you have, like, the
Lugosi, Karloff.
Are pretty much only known, even though they did other things. At least mostly, not so much Lugosi. Probably.
Yeah, but Lugosi was in those Ed Wood movies.
He was in an Ed Wood movie.
He needed money.
They called her horror. But whereas Karloff, he was a dramatic actor. He played Frankenstein, and that is what he is known for forever. But then you also have, like, the modern ones, like Bruce Campbell, cult icon, you know?
Yeah.
Boris Karloff also read The Grinch.
He did.
You could argue has more elements.
I mean, it is...
What's really going on up there on Mount Crumpets?
Yeah, seriously.
Nothing. That's why he spends all year scheming against these, like, people who are just living their lives. I'm going to go ruin their celebration.
Maybe that's a discussion for a December's podcast.
Yes. The more horrifying film is the Jim Carrey one.
I mean, that's a horror level. That's a horror movie, and so is the Mike Myers Cat in the Hat.
More so than Mike Myers.
Oh, that's an actual horror. That's psychological.
Similar to Requiem for a Dream. I don't think I can get through Cat in the Hat.
That's a crime against humanity.
It's also weird, like, movies that maybe are meant to be a horror, but they are so disturbing because they miss the mark or just the taste of anyone that they're kind of considered notorious.
A lot of the early CGI stuff that just ended up so far in the uncanny valley that it's like, I've never seen the film Delgo, but I've seen stills, and I'm just like, no, absolutely not.
Oh, God.
I'm just going to throw out Robert Zemeckis' Beowulf, which you could argue Beowulf has monsters.
Yeah, Beowulf is...
But they are not the scary part.
No.
It's the creepy animation, and why is he naked?
The Polar Express.
Tom Hanks is
Tom Hanks is everyone.
With zombie Tom. Yeah.
Robert Zemeckis needs to stop.
Or just, lean further into the horror.
Yeah, maybe if you just made it really disturbing.
Well, that's, what was it? I was reading, because I got just sort of hyper-focused for like a good month during summer on the film Small Soldiers. And a big reason...
That scared me when I was a kid.
Yes, that's actually a big reason it wasn't sort of bigger. Because like a lot of people were like, no, it's actually not bad as a movie. But for younger kids, imagining that their toys could come to life and hurt them.
To hurt them.
The opposite of Toy Story. But also, Joe Dante did Small Soldiers.
He did do
He's
that.
a horror director.
Yeah. And
he did Gremlins.
He did Gremlins.
It got the same response. Like, oh, this is fun, but why is it so violent?
Why am I terrified?
There's a part where the soldiers jerry-rig, like, a little truck that shoots nails, and the father, like, gets it, like, his leg is torn up by all these nails that get shot at him. And it's like, okay, that was not on my bingo card for this.
There's a full, like, Frankenstein's laboratory scene where they're, turning the Barbies into more soldiers.
Oh, I remember that scene.
They actually use the Bride of Frankenstein's theme as the leitmotif.
I haven't thought of that in years. Wow, you guys just brought that up.
Again, I would love to sit down and do just a segment on just horror for kids and kids movies that accidentally were horror. There's, you mentioned Toy Story. The scenes with Sid, I know a lot of people who had nightmares about.
And
Well,
it's funny
Sid was early CGI.
I mean, yes, that too.
Okay, besides that, but yeah.
But like
Sid's
his
creation,
Frankensteining toys.
Or like rising from the mud.
Yeah.
Which is actually kind of a throwback to Freaks, which, again, drama, horror, we're not really sure.
It's pretty much a drama until
the ending.
The ending is very much a horror movie.
kids stuff. That's horror. Courage the Cowardly Dog.
Oh my.
Oh,
It's all about disturbing
Our
imagery.
generation definitely was.
Return the slab. There's about, I don't know how many listeners we have, but any of them that are roughly my age just had a moment.
Oh, what about like the final episode where Courage is trying to fall asleep and there's that 3D thing that visits him in a dream? It just goes, "You're not perfect."
Yeah.
I know people that were like, "That's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen."
The little claymation girl in one of the doorway gags. There's a lot. And, I personally feel like horror is something that kids love.
Kids love bond over.
Yeah.
I will say.
It's so interesting, and it is something that I feel like the more Disney era of animation kind of has let slide a lot.
There's definitely a fearfulness about like disturbing or possibly disturbing images. Which again, I mean, there's movies that maybe like, they miss the mark with kids. Like, if you've ever seen Return to Oz, I don't know anymore. Because watching as an adult, I was like, "What is this?"
Yeah, what are they?
With heads.
Are they the Wheelers or something?
Which are in the books, to be fair.
Yeah, that all of the stuff in that film is in the books, but
Weird.
Yikes.
Yeah, it's creepy. It's different. I loved it.
Great effects in that one, too.
Also, yes. But I mean, there are people who actually, like, on the old Bravo list of, like, 100 scariest horror movies, one of them is The Wizard of Oz, the normal Judy Garland one with the flying monkeys. That gave so many people growing up nightmares.
I was afraid of the flying monkeys.
Oh, The Witch is pretty. Margaret Hamilton, another shout out to, OG.
Goated.
But she's kind of terrifying as the witch because she wants to possibly kill this kid, and that is part of the plot.
Yeah, her in that makeup is considered so unnerving. There was an episode with her on Sesame Street that they just cut from syndication. It was lost media for the better part of 2 decades.
I did not know that. Wow.
They only recently found a print, essentially.
I've only seen stills of it.
Yeah, it is only recent, very recent, that we have footage from that episode. And, that's in fairness, Sesame Street, a much younger audience, but...
I think people, or maybe they'll stay for granted, like, oh, it's the Wicked Witch, they know what it is.
Yeah.
Forget why we're afraid of witches in a lot of media, right?
Well, the unfortunate truths for why we're afraid of witches are...
True.
Largely steeped in sexism and a little bit in anti-Semitism, given the noses, probably.
In some ways, or women.
Yeah, women having power is apparently enough when you're in the 1600s to be scary.
But then also you see how witches, especially right now, it's kind of going through a resurgence where we go through eras of them being like villains, or maybe not like the main villain, but kind of like a
side
instigator of problems. But now it's like there are good witches, or they're chaotic, but ultimately not so bad. Witches are
They give Jack Nicholson a run for his money.
Also a wonderful movie. I mean, it's also even like the Hocus Pocus movies. People love them.
There's only one.
I guess, yeah.
We would all like to pretend.
We like to pretend.
They've announced a third.
We're only showing one of them as an event this month.
There's one full-length Hocus Pocus movie, and then they appear again in an extended Walgreens commercial.
CBS.
Yeah. And that makes it funnier because there is not a Walgreens in Salem. There is a CVS.
See that?
And Binks Returns and the sequel series, NCIS.
How to make that
forever.
My point being, those witches, they are the bad guys, but they're so likable and quoted by like every woman my age as relatable.
They also want to kill children.
They also want to kill children, but kind of like with Margaret Hamilton, I'm like, kind of likable as you get used to them.
We'll fix that in post.
I'm not expecting that or anything.
I was actually reminded when we were talking about horror for kids and sort of animated horror, it reminded me of, and if you guys don't remember this, I totally get it. but there was an animated film that always airs on Cartoon Network around this time of year called Scary Godmother.
Oh, yes.
I've seen parts of it. I don't think I've ever saw the full.
It's actually based on I think we have the graphic novel here.
Yeah.
But it sort of turns on the idea of like, fairy godmother, but instead she's a witch. All of her friends are like monsters, but they sort of help convince this girl that like, they're not terrifying. Like, they're not out to get her. They look kind of scary, but they're decent people.
I've always loved likable monsters, like even when they're in their horror glory, they're actually kind of sweet. Again, I think that's why I like the kaiju movies where Mothra's actually on our side, or Godzilla was fighting for those kids. Yeah. I think it's just a kid especially.
Gamera is friend of children.
Absolutely. But you kind of you love the idea of having this intimidating, scary monster kind of fighting your battles for you. You know, there's also a side of... Yes, actually. There is a side of horror that makes us kind of wish we were in touch with that kind of ugly side of things. And I think that's sort of again, one of the draws, really.
It is funny. Almost every major Godzilla monster has been both the villain and the hero. Even King Ghidorah, one of the films is King Ghidorah, Mothra, and Rodan fighting Godzilla, and they're the defenders of Earth.
It's not Rodan.
It's not Rodan?
It's Baragon.
That's Baragon, that's right. It's the other D-lister.
Apparently the director had to pull a lot of strings to get Baragon in that movie.
So we will mention Baragon on this podcast.
But also, the Godzilla in that film is actually supposed to be sort of the collection of souls from the bombings.
Yeah.
So he's like this, he has white eyes. He's terrifying.
He is a monster among monsters.
It's funny we keep going back to Godzilla, but he sort of is a great symbol of what horror can stand in for. The new Godzilla movies, I don't know if I call them horror, they're definitely more like action.
Yeah.
But again, that's actually kind of the monsters are showing up because the environment and the world is out of balance. It is meant to be that stand-in for what happens when we let this go so far, Mother Nature gives us a big monster.
While I did appreciate that angle, it annoys me that Biollante was not used, considering she is the only...
Yet.
She's,
monster's the perfect full.
I mean, Hedorah, that was his point in the 70s. Hedorah was the fear of pollution.
The ending of Shin Godzilla, the final shot is so... We're talking about horror. So creepy. With the things growing off of
Shin Godzilla definitely is the more horrific Godzilla movies in recent years.
The Shin films are all a little bit more leaning into their horror elements.
Shin Ultraman horror?
I haven't seen Ultraman, but buddy, Shin Kamen Rider. Lot of violence. A lot more violence than I'm used to from a Sentai show. Well, he's Tokusatsu, but that's another podcast.
You said that a lot this time.
I think again,
are we geeking out?
Horror bleeds into everything.
It really does.
And that's why, we've discussed everything from, children's cartoons to multiple series from Japan, and oddly enough, classic literature, of course, pops up. Horror is everywhere.
Horror is a very important genre that I think is pushed aside a lot because a lot of it's made for cheap, so it's regarded as trash. And nowadays you hear this fancy, it's elevated horror. It's shut up. Okay? Any horror can be elevated horror. Yeah, just because it's made by A24 doesn't mean it's elevated.
Yeah, again, to bring it back to Tales from the Crypt, that was that was HBO's show. At that point in time, that was what Game of Thrones was at its height. There are actors whose careers were launched by Tales from the Crypt. They pulled in some big-name celebrities, too. Horror, when it's quality, it shows, even if not always the most appreciated genre.
That's sort of the thing behind, Val Lewton, right? The studio wanted a bunch of, B horror movies.
Very cheap, make us this movie. But he was an artist of integrity and wrote actually decent, pretty psychological thrillers. Val Lewton is a very good example because, he was said make a movie called The Cat People. So you're expecting cat monsters. It's actually about a woman's breakdown and, her struggling with sexual identity and urges with, sort of what her role is supposed to be in a marriage and society in her, culture. That movie's got layers, and it is really scary. It's very scary at times.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of horror is at its best when it is something that has those kinds of layers. A personal favorite of mine, and it's kind of a cheesier one, but I loved the Ginger Snap movies.
Ginger Snaps!
Ginger Snaps. That is Speaking of scary, the parts of that movie are scary.
Some of the effects were phenomenal.
Yeah, I love Ginger Snaps.
Ginger Snaps. I kind of wish I'd seen that as a teenager because I don't think I've ever seen the horrors of puberty for a girl put into again. It sort of spoke to me because it's I didn't turn into a werewolf, but that is kind of a great.
You might as well.
It might as well have. Ginger Snaps is very.
You have that first film, which is dealing basically exactly with that, the changes of the body. The second film, not as good, but it's dealing with addiction and rehabilitation and all of that kind of stuff. I don't remember much about the prequel other than it was surprisingly good for a horror prequel.
I actually will say another of the recent movies, or more recent, Midsummer has a big reputation, and people will say, oh yeah, that scene where this happened. Oh yeah, that's scary. But I am still kind of freaked out by just how that movie started. It wastes no time in putting you in such a low spot that, again, another thing I love about horror, when you talk about rooting maybe for the wrong person, the main character, when she hits that final shot of her just smiling, you're just yes.
Yeah, she had to crawl out a long way.
She did, but again, and even though there are terrible things happening, you're just kind of this is better than where we were, guys. Because it's sort of I gotta say, it's sort of a masterful way to really, make you feel things that you didn't think you could.
It is interesting, because we've had a lot of, very big hits lately with horror.
We have.
Some of them perhaps were larger in popularity, mostly due to memes. Malignant comes to mind.
Let's not talk any trash on Malignant.
Hey, I liked the movie. I liked the movie a lot.
I have a friend who got a tattoo of Malignant.
That movie is so
I'm the minority.
wackadoo bonkers.
It's absolute insanity.
Chaos reigns with that movie.
A movie doesn't have to be it's intellectual. No. You can just have fun with horror.
The other big recent release I can think of is Megan.
That was a good movie.
Which was also, again, really good, but
AI fears.
Yeah.
But in a way that's funny, but also haha, no, but seriously.
No, this feels like this could happen.
Oh yeah, it will. Yeah, that's another thing is when horror movies have actually kind of happened, you look back at even some of the older ones, you're ooh, that is real.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I'll talk about how we're all pop.
I was going to say something else, but I'll just leave that one on the cutting room floor.
I'll take pods over Triffids any day.
I'm actually surprised you're familiar with Day of the Triffids.
That is a horrifying concept to me, and I couldn't tell you why.
That movie is the same class in which I first watched The Invisible Man. I watched Day of the Triffids, and boy, I hope the story that it's based on is interesting, because that movie was nothing.
They've done more recent adaptations of it.
I've heard, and it's funny, I do my yearly trip up to Salem. The Peabody Essex Museum there usually has a collection of horror memorabilia. I cannot remember who provides it. It's a musician. It's his collection. He just shows it off every year up there. And that dude is obsessed with Day of the Triffids, of all things.
Everyone has their movie.
Yeah.
It is always kind of interesting because, horror hits so many different points that the horror buffs might be really fond of something like Scream or Cabin in the Woods, where it's hey, this is a horror movie about horror movies. Mm-hmm. There was another one I saw recently that I can't remember, but it's basically making fun of slashers. And it's literally just an interview with a slasher killer for most of the film. And the last section is them realizing, oh, he's going to kill all of us. I cannot remember what the name of it was.
Kind of sounds like there's a movie, things from Europe. And
said with such disdain.
But it's kind of the same thing you're talking about. It's called Man Bites Dog. And it's documentary filmmakers following this murderer around as he does what he does.
Yes.
And murders people. But then slowly the crew starts getting involved in the murders. That's a cool movie. That's not really technically horror, but that's a horror movie.
I mean, again,
the coaster for that movie is just
Oh. I mean, that also makes me think of one of my favorite horror comedies, which I think is way more comedy than horror, is What We Do in the Shadows.
Oh, yeah.
It's about a documentary crew following vampires around, totally just observing them kill and do what vampires do in the most mundane of settings. There's a lot of blood in that movie, actually.
Yeah, tons. it did well enough to get its own television series.
Which is just as good.
Which is, yeah.
And a great spin-off series called Legend Paranormal.
Oh, that
I have
show.
a shout-out for that.
There was another one, right? Werewolves.
There's another one.
I think
That's some
Get on
research
this.
to do.
I know that was at least a pitched idea. I don't know if it ever got.
Like the guys that are like, we're werewolves, not swearwolves. Those guys.
A lot of great lines.
Reese Darby's going to be at the Casway.
Are we going? I think horror is a lot of fun. I feel like even if you're, I totally get, because like I said, I grew up being kind of terrified to get into horror movies, my little exposure that I had, but there's like a lot to find that will, I think it's good for everyone to find their one, even if it's not what other people consider as scary. It might not even be what is called a traditional horror movie, but you find your kind of fear, and it is kind of nice to see that exploited on the screen so that you have like that basis, you know? It's so much fun, like we've had today, talking with other people about movies that freak them out, you know?
Oh, yeah.
That scene in The Sixth Sense where he's hiding in his little tent.
Oh, don't stop.
I was young when I saw that, and even now I'm thinking about it, and I'm getting a little spooked. Just thinking about it.
Again, Sixth Sense, I think some people go, oh, whatever, and they roll their eyes. But that movie's effective.
There is some, and I mean this in a good way, miserable scenes in that movie.
Yeah. It also, again, it is a premise I had seen before, but it's still a fun movie.
Executed so well, and just...
And like...
You're right. There's a scene, especially, again, if you see it at a young age and it involves a child, you just kind of imprint on these characters, and you can't help but feel like, that was what happened to me.
One of the... One of the easiest ways to make horror more effective is involve children. Mm-hmm. Either as the monster, which, those... you get, like Omen or...
Devil's Backbone.
Yeah.
That's pretty much
the orphan. Yeah. Oh, and of course, Children of the Corn. Yeah. Kids are monsters, and I love that. Sometimes it's just like, no, the monster is just children.
Yeah, it's sort of funny. It goes from, like, the fear of, like, the vulnerability of children to these kids freak me out.
And you see that a lot in, like, the 50s, the end of the 50s towards the 60s especially, where apparently the boomers were really afraid, or really scaring, rather, their parents.
I was going to say, like...
Is it like Village of the Damned? Is it Village of the Damned?
I think I confuse that with Children of the Corn a lot. Which are the one with blonde kids?
That's Village of the Damned.
Yeah, Iron Maiden wrote a song about it.
And there was a parody episode of it on The Simpsons.
There was a parody of it on The Simpsons.
Sorry, guys. I'm not like up to date.
Like five.
To be fair, name a horror movie. There's probably a parody of it, especially with the Treehouse of Horrors. That one was just a regular episode.
Some of those episodes are freaky, too.
I remember seeing Treehouse of Horrors on TV and being kind of freaked out. Don't laugh. Sometimes it's scary.
Some of them more than others. My personal favorite was not particularly scary. It was just a parody of both Bram Stoker's Dracula and The Lost Boys.
We talked a little bit about Dracula, but it's, again, spawned so much.
Everyone's talking about Dracula.
Nosferatu is still a freaky movie.
I think, Nosferatu, actually, for the vampire movie without much blood in it, it's kind of the worst.
Yeah.
Then there's also the remake in the 70s by Werner Herzog, that very scary.
Yeah.
Starring Klaus Kinski, who is a horror character in and of himself.
Also, no, what's the Shadow Vampire?
Shadow Vampire, yeah. That's
a fake retelling of the making of Nosferatu.
Yes.
Plays them. But the idea that they found an actor, Max Shrek was the actor, but the idea is, what if he was actually just a vampire? And again,
produced by Clive Barker.
Oh, possibly.
That sounds right.
But it's kind of what you're talking about movies where the crew gets involved in murders. This crew is complicit in watching this guy kill people and eat them. Which I guess is also the idea of, like, when does it, like, where do you draw the line? Even in the fictional universe of, whoa, are we letting this happen?
It's interesting because that one was still a bit before, because I feel like horror hasn't really had as much of the crossover with reality TV as I would expect with how much reality TV has become the norm.
That's so interesting, because I've seen, like, so many, like, sci-fi talks about reality TV going too far. I think there's, like, a whole Doctor Who.
There are multiple Doctor Who episodes about specifically that.
Yeah.
Actually, amusingly enough, due to Magic the Gathering, I've just started rewatching the post Ninth Doctor seasons. So I just watched the episode with there's literally an episode with actual Christian Satan in it.
True.
Oh, I forgot about that
Yeah,
episode.
it's not a good episode.
It's not good.
It's kind of dumb. But
Yeah,
then you have...
Angels,
yes,
I think,
then you have...
messed up a whole bunch of people.
Blink is both like the perfect bottle episode of Doctor Who and a phenomenal horror story, while basically remaining completely PG. Nobody dies in Blink, technically. You are just sent back in time until you live to death.
Nobody is killed.
Yes. Nobody is killed.
People
would be
die,
the most
people aren't
accurate
killed.
explanation.
What are the things called in Doctor Who? I think they're actually scarier than the Weeping Angels, where you forget about them after
Silence.
Silence.
That's the kind of stuff that really freaks me out.
Oh, yeah.
And they have to like all marked
The-
up to.
Oh, right.
remind
You just see them like
themselves.
growing with these marks and
Yeah,
like,
that's
seeing
scary.
them. Forgetting is also kind of a freaky trope in like horror. Just,
Oh, yeah.
not really being in control of it.
That's what Cure is about. There's a lot
Really?
of stuff in that movie Cure that's about someone who has amnesia, but he forgets. Like he'll be talking and then forget, and then forget, and then forget. Like he has no short-term memory.
kind of like Memento.
Memento,
It's like
yeah.
going backwards,
Yeah.
it's, as you discover what's really happening, it's a horrifying.
It was Joe Pantoliano the whole time.
Any chance to talk about Joe?
He's my boy.
He's got a fun name.
Coach Antoliano.
Favorite Star Wars character.
Favorite hobbies.
And that's another thing where we have definitely had only a handful of full, like, sci-fi horror. You know, Alien being the big, obvious one. Like, that is a horror film more than it is a sci-fi
But
film.
sci-fi really does lend to horror. I mean, you got War of the Worlds, which was a Victorian novel that has been adapted to so many different time periods because it works.
Frankenstein is a.
Frankenstein's technically science
Frankenstein
fiction.
is technically the first science... Well,
The Twilight,
is credited as the first science fiction.
the Twilight Zone is usually considered a sci-fi over horror, but those episodes
There are some absolute...
terrifying.
You can do a lot with science fiction just because the fear of technology, but then there's like the fear of space.
Space being
But then
the
Yeah,
Horizon.
space is... Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel like actually some of the scariest things I've seen probably take place in space. Because who wants to go there?
I don't.
That's apparently just Jason and the Leprechaun want to go to space. I don't want to.
Jason X is awesome.
I don't want to hang out with either of those jerks.
Jason X?
Jason
We
X.
gotta watch Jason.
Yeah,
X.
that's
so.
that's the one in
kind
space.
Of a parody of the Friday the 13th movies,
But
but
it's
Yeah.
in space.
It's in space.
David Cronenberg's in it.
I do love Cronenberg.
Yes.
If I have to deal with horror in space, the only things I want to hang out with are Tom Servo and Crow.
Crow, yeah.
Making fun movies in space.
Yeah, that's a vibe.
I mean, to be fair, that is actually one of my favorite ways to watch classic horror. Things I've seen before. It is great to just sit down and laugh with friends. And
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there are some that are just like, there's nothing going on in this movie. You have to talk over this if you want to finish it.
Oh, sure.
so, Manos, the Hands of Fate.
Oh, boy, that is such a word. Oh, my God.
If you know, you know. And if you don't know, while I will not recommend that you watch Manos, The Hands of Fate, I will recommend watching the Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode of Manos, The Hands of Fate.
And I've watched a lot of stinkers.
It's
The Madmen of Mandoras comes to mind. That's what Ann Handler's head in the jar.
Oh,
Gotta love that. Don't worry, it melts
yeah.
again. Yeah, you got it. Ladies and gentlemen, you got it.
Just want to touch on upcoming horror. Is there anything you guys are excited for? Is there anything that's been
That's a good question.
teased, hinted at?
Oh, yeah, actually. Robert Eggers' new movie is his retelling of Nosferatu.
Again, I'm a sucker for a good Nosferatu.
And-
can't go wrong with Count Orloff.
Yeah, and
And Robert Eggers is a great
Robert
horror actor.
Eggers, he's the guy to do it, I think, after The Witch and The Lighthouse, which is a comedy. I will go to my
A horrifying comedy.
my grave with that.
How have we not had more of those?
And like, I would say The Norseman is more of a horror movie
Oh, yeah.
than Lighthouse is.
I was
that-
just thinking about one of those
Norseman is
scenes like, oh, that was
absolutely a
kind of
horror
gross.
movie.
Yeah, even when he's doing like a historical epic, it's a horror movie. Because again, history's
History's-
pretty horrifying, guys.
Yeah.
Wasn't Horrible Histories like a famous show for kids about how terrible history was?
History is.
We're all terrible.
Yeah, that one episode where they just showed The Norseman in full was crazy.
That's some Candle Coves level right there.
I'm not sure what I'm looking forward to. I'm kind of just enjoying rewatching classic horror movies I've never seen, but I definitely look forward to like favorite directors like Robert Eggers. Or Gil does another horror movie soon because I feel like he's 3 for 3 right now.
Yeah.
It's either that or they'll finally let him do something with gargoyles.
Oh,
Maybe there'll be a horror movie. Again, it's horror.
You could do some horror with
as long
gargoyles.
as they bring back Keith David. Yeah, bring back Keith David.
He was in Nope, so
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, he's still around. He's still
it was good to
doing.
see him when he was there.
He's still doing his Keith David things.
I'm not really sure about any new horror. Just sort of when it happens and it looks good, you watch it.
I know they're making a new Hellraiser, and
The last one was good.
that's the thing, is Hellraiser is probably, like, of the, like, franchises for horror, I love the Hellraiser movies, even though most of them are absolute trash.
They are trash, but they're different trash.
Yes. Like, the first 2 films are phenomenal, and then it's all kind of bad, and then it gets good again recently, so I'm like, maybe? It's kind of the antithesis of Chucky, where it's like, oh cool, this is just more Chucky. Hellraiser, I'm going to flip a coin, and I'm either going to like this, or I'm going to want an hour and a half of my life back.
But you're at least guaranteed that you've never seen anything quite like it before.
They're all so very weird.
Yes.
Do you have any plans to
also,
check out?
There is one other one that I just remembered, although it was literally like just announced, is apparently somebody's going to try and do a Langoliers movie again.
Oh.
And there's no way it's going to be good. The book is, it's a Stephen King novel. It is one of the worst Stephen King adaptations, with maybe the exception of Maximum Overdrive.
Didn't he direct that?
Yes.
We love you, Mr.
Listen. Carrie is so good that I will let Stephen King movies be as bad as the rest of them are.
And there's some, like, again, some of his movies, or movies based on his work, are some considered the greatest of all time. Like The Shining.
The Shining, Carrie, Christine. Amusingly enough, I know for a fact he hates at least Christine and that version of The Shining.
Get over it, Steven.
And the new version of The Shining was...
Yeah, Steven, if you're listening, get over it.
Also, if you're listening, like...
It's a trend, isn't it?
If you're listening, we're in the middle of nowhere, but, like, come to a signing. It'd be hilarious.
Yeah, come on down. Come to the Lansdowne Library, Steven.
We'd love to have you on if there's anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, you're so much better than Clive Barker. I was kidding.
But if Clive Barker wants to come to...
Yeah, Clive, if you're listening, come to the Lansdowne Library.
Stop inviting.
Sorry.
Oh, they are authors.
Yeah.
And, again, the reason horror is the way it is today.
Yeah, I mean, love him or hate him, Stephen King is hugely influential. He would argue many of his films, but many of the adaptations of his books are very loose, but, sometimes that's the right call. There's definitely a scene in it that did not need to be filmed, Stephen. I don't know why I'm just now assuming he's listening, but,
Yes.
Dedicate this just for Stephen.
Yes, to Stephen.
It's like the YouTube thing, just a dark screen and then in white just for Stephen. What happened to Stephen?
We'll mail him a password that he can type in to get, like, this version. But do you have any plans for the Five Nights at Freddy's movie?
Oh, yeah, that's a thing that's happening.
I mean, I'm actually very curious because I was so shocked because I don't really know anything about it besides it's a game. But there's such a following of a lot younger ages than I was ever comfortable with horror. I'm kind of curious to see what this movie is like.
Maybe a topic for another podcast, but the current, explosion in horror games specifically aimed at young kids fascinates the heck out of me. Your Five Nights at Freddy's, your Poppy's Playtimes, your...
Silent Hill 2.
Hey, I grew up on Silent Hill 2. I am probably the only person...
Manhunt.
I'm probably the only person that got the alien ending in Silent Hill 2 first, because I was playing a continue from my sister's save file, and apparently that's just a thing that can happen if you do a new game.
There's one where there's like a cat.
Well, yeah, because all of the other ones, it's a dog. Silent Hill is as much comedy as it is horror, but only for the endings. I would have absolutely died if either of the Silent Hill movies had actually done the alien ending. That would have killed me.
Kind of like Clue, where they only show it in like select theaters out of like all of them.
I wish more films did that with different endings depending on the theater you saw it at. It's goofy, but it'd be hilarious to do that with a horror franchise.
Guillermo del Toro, if you're listening, you want to get
God, how is that the first time he's come up in this conversation?
No, it's not. We mentioned Devil's Backbone.
Oh, that's true. We did.
I got you, man. But yeah, if you're listening, please come to the Lansdowne Library.
and then come over and we'll watch movies.
We'll hang out.
I mean, you would absolutely love the Mutter Museum. I guarantee it. I mean,
he could probably write a whole movie based on just looking at a Philadelphia cheesesteak.
Wow.
Be inspired.
That's a weird pull.
And on that note, thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you, Guillermo. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Clive, for listening. For listening.
I have no idea how Alex is going to feel when he edits this.
Alex, if you're listening, can you get Clive Barker to come to the Lansdowne Library?
This is all going to get cut.
Don't cut this, Alex. I'm not going to be another episode again if you cut this.
There's going to be so many weird edits for the end of this episode.
We should wrap up for time. Lauren, John, thank you so much for coming in here and geeking out with us.
Yeah,
thank you.
As beyond just the number of other topics that we literally said, oh, that's a whole nother podcast, I'm sure we'll get you back for maybe something a little more focused in regards to horror.
I kind of like this.
I mean, don't get me wrong. There is absolute wonder in just like the mental equivalent of word salad that is our discussions. Yeah. But, you know.
Again, you'll find parts you like. I think we touched on enough of it. I'd be surprised if there wasn't something for everyone there.
Well, if any of our listeners would like to share a word salad or maybe break some bread, maybe have a soup, Jeff, where can they go to get on the podcast?
Well, if you head on over to our website, lansdownlibrary.org/podcast, there's a green register here button. Click that and you'd let us know that you'd like to join us and fill in, what topic it is you'd like to discuss.